welcome to my fellow women in this group. And thank you to the men for the support you give us. And as we know, the most common Women's Day thing is, may we know them, may we be them, and may we raise them. And I think especially the raising of strong women is a call to all of us, not just to the women in this group. So it's wonderful to be part of this IACD family and for us to be having our 25th regional webinar. So well done to Daniel for starting all those many months ago with running these things. I think we are shining a light and creating a benchmark in IACD internationally for these webinars. So well done to Daniel and his team for starting this whole season of webinars. And today we have the pleasure of welcoming Daniel, and in absentia, his colleague Judy, who is in Chile, so she can't join us, but she's been part of putting the presentation together. So Daniel will be talking to us about recentering culture in community development. And then we'll have time at the end for some questions and comments. If you've got comments in the meantime, you can always put them into the chat and we'll keep an eye on them there. So thank you, Daniel, and over to you.
Thank you, Janine, and colleagues. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever the time of day for you. As Janine has indicated, welcome to this 25th edition of our IACD Sub-Saharan Africa region webinar series. It's always a pleasure to meet so many of you over the many editions you've had, faithfully supporting what we are doing in the region. And we feel honored that we always have to have this global presence with us, including some of the seasoned practitioners who bring a wealth of knowledge and experience gained over years to inform our discussions. Well, this is also a special day. We are celebrating women, and happy International Women's Day. Well, let's come together and promote the digital revolution as we build an equitable society for all of us. Today, again, let me give the apologies of my co-presenter, Judy Obel, who is on holiday in Chile. She would have wished to be here, but then when you look at the time difference, then she's in a zone where people are supposed to be sleeping, and it would have been quite an inhospitable hour for her to wake up to present, but she sends her regards to all of us as we discuss this topic, where again we are talking about one of the critical aspects and issues and features and phenomena that we have to deal with in the course of our community development practice. Of course, starting with the topic we've been talking about, is it centering, is it all recentering culture in community development? Of course, that's a question we'll answer at the end, because often we go doing community development, and in quite a number of cases, culture becomes important depending on what approach we start with. Or in other cases, we find ourselves running so fast so that in the course of the day, we start looking for culture when it is necessary. But this is the topic for the day, and it's also a topic that, again, is assuming center stage in the Practice Insights magazine that IACD is producing for this season. We have 14 submissions. We're inviting for more submissions on culture and community development. We've moved the deadline to 15th of March to allow a lot more of us to make their presentations. And so allow me to take a few minutes just to, again, talk about some of the issues which I'm sure you're also familiar with relating to culture and community development. Yeah, I will start by just pinpointing about the issue of the primacy of culture in our community life. And when I talk about primacy of culture, I talk about culture being so primary, so fundamental, and so foundational in any community's life. And us as community practitioners, then that is where we need and we ought to start our practice. And quoting a Senegalese grandmother, Chobo, says culture is the most important thing in life. and let's trust our grandmothers to know what is best for us. In terms of just, I'll run through a few definitions just to establish a common understanding on what we mean by culture, and including building a context. And Modicat states that culture offers the context, the values, the subjectivity, the attitudes, and the skills on which development processes must take place. Meaning, it builds a foundation, it builds a setting, it creates a space, but of course guided by values, attitudes, and all that constitutes culture, so that then we can be able now to do our development process. Culture, again to UNESCO 2010, is seen as a necessary element. We could have said culture is an element for full development of people and communities, but then the emphasis necessary, meaning we can't do without it. If at all we are going to talk about full development of people and communities. I will like quoting this definition by Olatunde. Is in a foundational book for sociologists, and Olatunde sees culture as referring to the total way of life of a society. Total, not just way of life, total way of life. Every aspect of society's life is informed by culture. And he goes on to elaborate that it's made up of the members' customs, traditions, beliefs, behavior, dress, language, their work, way of living, relationship networks, our attitudes to life, focus of group loyalties, and our worldview. Because basically culture gives us the lens with which we're able to focus on what happens around us and with us all the time. But then it's also important to take note that culture is not static. Most of the time when you talk about culture, you go to the customs and traditions, which are out there and most of them not challengeable. But then culture is not static. It's not a static set of values and the practices, because again, it's continuously recreated as situations warrant, and as again, new ideas become available through the interchange that we go through as we come in contact with others and we're exposed to new innovations and inventions. And so that becomes important to look at culture as also dynamic. Equally, I want also to indicate that culture, being so important, also serves very important functions in society, and of course, by extension, or if we become reductionist, in communities and even in our individual selves. One, the identities that we have as individuals, the identities that we have as communities, the identities we have as society is assigned to us by culture. And that's why socialization becomes so important and so foundational again. But not that then again, culture is also going to be able to locate us in space and time, because again, it links us with the present and the past and the future, so that then we can be able to have a sense of bearing even as we navigate through our communities. Culture also assigns us the roles that we play in society, and being who we are, then to a large extent is no accident. Culture has played a significant part in it, and therefore then it locates men and women, boys and girls in whatever roles the society thinks is most important for all of us. And so as community development practitioners, then we need to also to be informed by this as we now call upon people to take part in the community development discourse and action activities. Culture is a creator of social order. The whole issue of norms, the whole issue of social sanction mechanisms, that's culturally defined and enforced. And then, of course, establishing the institutions to make society function, and ultimately defining the cosmos so that then we can link ourselves with the spiritual beings. Every other society is religious in one way or the other. And that is the centrality and that's the primacy of culture in our communities. But then, as we do community development, one of the things that we impact on is culture. We cause change, because in the process of prosecuting community development, implementing the ideas, implementing the innovations that we bring on, and we package them in projects, in programs, if they are bigger, we are causing change. And when we cause change, then we are impacting on aspects of our culture. And in as much as then we alter the existing social order and functioning of communities, then to a large extent, this brings in a challenge. In some cases, brings a clash with the existing culture, because ultimately you touch one aspect and then there's a spiral is perfect in the rest of the other elements that compose culture. And in the process, of course, there are all those who will benefit from the social order, and all those who want and will be more comfortable even an existing order and predictability exists. For sociologists, it's very important that predictability in interaction is maintained. And so when we undertake our community development and we impact so heavily on culture or elements of culture through our projects and through undertakings to make people's lives better, then that in itself becomes quite a challenge. And so we need to be able then to position ourselves to see how then we leverage and benefit from the whole process of undertaking our projects and programs in community development, and also ensuring stability in culture or respecting the centrality of culture where we don't need to impact on it at any point in time. Of course, the stimulus and the initiative for change will come from different directions and from different forces, some from within, others from without the community. And often, again, we become anthropological. As practitioners, we can adopt an emic approach, where again we'll investigate how local people think, that's the community, how they perceive, categorize, and organize the world, the rules that apply within the community, and the meanings that obtain in the network, in the networking, and in the organizing of development in the communities, and also getting down from an endemic perspective to get to the lives of the people and start imagining, explaining things from their perspective, so that we can be able to build from where they are and leverage from what they exist in the community. And ultimately, as community practitioners, then we can also have some measure of empathy as we undertake community development. But this empathy also has to be informed by the culture that is in place within the community, and we need to embrace it that much. But equally, there is also the ethic approach, which to a large extent gives us some room in our operation, again, to act as outsiders, and often we are outsiders in our community development practice. And so our shift, this shifts focus to a large extent in the way now we look at things as outsiders. And more often, we would want to see members of the community as too involved, in some cases, even to interpret their culture impartially. And so, to a large extent, we start extending our guiding hand, and many at the times we become prescriptive rather than being part and parcel of looking for solutions to what needs to be changed, to be addressed, to be sorted out in making everybody's lives much better. And that lies in the problem, because immediately become prescriptive. Most of the time also, we start also becoming and challenging or not appreciating the culture the way it ought to be appreciated. Whereas we try to see how culture links up with community development, again, we might also want to look at the definitions that we have. And of course, with all due respect to IACD's definition, most of the time we start with giving the value proposition, where we talk about community development as participative democracy, on and on. But for community development, what is important is the aspect of organization, the aspect of education, so that everybody is at a level of awareness and competence to do what needs to be done to make lives better. The whole process of empowerment of people within their communities, whether in local identity or interest, urban or rural, so that ultimately we can be able to promote these values that are important, that make us who we are, or ought to make us who we are as people living in dignity. But then all this, again, to a large extent, needs to be contextualized within the culture of the communities. Incidentally, some of these values, of course, cut across most of the human society. And that's why we end up again with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which then is a summary of all that we aspire as human beings. Within our local context, again, Government of Kenya document 2022, in one of the policy documents on working with groups, sees community development as a process where communities will take collective actions and generate solutions. The mandate to take collective actions, of course, is born also out of the collective will and sovereignty of the people, which to a large extent, again, is drawn from the culture of the people, so that then they can be able to prescribe for themselves solutions also to what faces them collectively. And so to a large extent, then what I'm saying is that the actions we take, the actions that are taken in the name of community development need to be validated by the community's cultural perspectives of what is valuable to them. Most of the time we talk about community development as if it is universal, but then it can only be a community development that applies to the community, within the confines of the culture that the community is promoting or subscribes to. And so the cultural validation of what we do becomes important. Of course, most of the time, again, in quite some bit of literature, we see culture as, in some cases, a promoter, and in some cases also as a barrier to community development. Of course, the question of where we learn to leverage the value propositions that we bring on board. When, again, we take into account, most of the time, we see human beings as very rational, and in some cases, of course, they can be quite irrational. But then, let's also appreciate that there are very many attributes of culture that are promotive of change. And most important, imbued in the culture and imbued in the humanity is the aspect of self-preservation that is within the communities. And that's why the normative systems and also the sanction mechanisms are enforced so ruthlessly by communities to ensure conformity and promotion of common good. Because culture is about promoting and protecting that which is of value to all of us. And of course, you can look at all these elements of culture that, again, are important in navigating through life and also are part of what then needs to be protected, so that then there is order in society. But equally, in the same spirit of self-preservation, there is also the whole issue of looking at what forces are at play to maintain some bit of cultural balance, and more so in terms of what is prescribed by the dominant ideology in the community. Of course, we also want to look at whether, of course, we want to question whether those who promote the dominant ideology also is an ideology that benefits all in some cases disadvantages others. But ultimately, we need to be able to negotiate the whole process so that then everybody can be able to be comfortable going forward. If we confront these established systems, then of course becomes quite problematic. Look at what happens in patriarchal societies. The unquestioned authority of men, it becomes quite a barrier. And in a day like today, when you are celebrating women, this is one of the issues, and one of the issues that still needs to be chipped so that everybody can be able to have some space in a dignified manner. And equally, of course, we are aware of matriarchal societies. In the Southern African part, we have some communities that are matriarchal, and the rest of the world, again, we have quite many matriarchal societies. And again, we need to be able then to understand these ideologies benefit also some of the gatekeepers in communities. And we need to then to be able to appreciate and look at how then we can be able to negotiate through all these narrow corridors, so that ultimately we can be able to serve social justice, and equally we can also ensure that we protect and promote the rights of all. And so it's within this context then that we are saying that we need to put culture at the center of any community development initiative. In terms of operationalizing our work of community development, if we can again minimize it to change, then there is a change through culture framework, which prescribes a few things that needs to be done, so that then we can be able to navigate through culture, even as we do community development and as we usher in a process of change in communities. But then, incidentally, I want to start by also again observing that often as community development practitioners, we tend to downplay the place of culture in our practice, and often do not adequately appreciate culturally defined power dynamics in communities, because we tend at times again to minimize our work to projects, which projects have timelines, which timelines at times then make it so difficult to have the liberty to harness some of the cultural intricacies and navigate through the cultural intricacies. And so we find a way of finding some common ground to move things very fast. You have a project of 3 years. Now, if you are going to embrace all the cultural dynamics and whatever happens, there is always a question. And so in our pressure to manage time, then of course, culture can be, again, marginalized in the process. Equally, when we focus on culture, then again, we are looking at the power dynamics in communities. we tend to focus on the functional positions, the functional roles that are going to facilitate what, again, we are trying to do. And so again, full engagement with elders, full engagement with those who possess indigenous knowledge in communities, then at times can be dismissed also as time consuming. And so once we pay the courtesy call, then we very quickly move to those whom we can work with. And in the process, we leave those who can also have the hammer of culture, which will help us go along. In the name of gender and community empowerment, again, cultural ordained division of roles that underpin the normative systems, again, can be nominally embraced. And that, again, brings in the whole issue of how we manage some of the tensions and conflicts and views and oppositions as we do community development. And so in the process, we can leave a lot of wounds in the course of our work when we don't fully embrace culture, even as we usher in the process of change. And so when we get to that point, this is a point at which at times then we start viewing culture and the customs, the traditions that have endured the test of time as obstacles, as barriers to change, because again, these need a much deeper and longer time to negotiate and to change. And so the end result of, in some cases, what we do is then to usher in community tensions and to do some misdirected community development interventions with minimal ownership by communities. And then the question is that community development, which again, when it is not so much underpinned by what people value, and culture is one of the most valued possessions by members of communities. And so the change through culture approach seeks to change this by giving culture its primary place in intermediating change processes in communities, and also equally in building on the culturally designated roles and values that underpin communities and community existence. I'll just run through some of the components, the 5 components in the change through culture framework, where foremost, we build upon cultural roles and values. And so as we get into communities, whatever we do, and however we operationalize our work, then we need to be able first and foremost to go into the culture and see how roles are constructed, how roles are divided and the justifications thereof and the meanings thereof, and also the value propositions that underpin the division of labor, so that then we can be able to be properly aligned. So that even then we're working with men, then we are working within the confines of the roles and the values that exist within the communities. And then we can see if there are any new value propositions, then we can see how to leverage on what already exists to move the process forward. And similarly, the same, if we're working with women, then again, we also need to understand the cultural propositions in terms of roles, and that what can be done, what cannot be done by women, and also the value propositions thereof, and then see how then again to navigate through the same process, so that again, we don't start getting conflicting situations where we're asking people to do roles that are not aligned with what is expected of them by the communities. And in the process, we create clashes, which then hinder what we want to achieve as community development practitioners. The second aspect in the change through culture framework is working with elders in all the phases of the program, the project cycle. Because right from the start, elders, they are guardians of community interests. And when you look at how people become elders in our communities, it's a whole process of preparation, it's a whole process of graduation from childhood, going through stages and rites of passage, so that by the time you are recognized as an elder in a community, the community is convinced that you are the best there is and you have the interests of the community at heart. And so as outsiders, when we come then to prosecute community development in those communities, then it is incumbent on us to understand that whatever other systems are in place, the elders are the guardians of the interests of the community. And in many other cases where nothing else happens if the elders are not given their blessing in terms of what happens. In quite many of cases, again, elders, they are the reference point. They're also the resource of what has happened. And in these days of climate change, we have elders who have lived almost a century. And so they can tell you what has happened over 100 years. And we can then be able to see how we can benefit from that wealth of knowledge, even as we do our 3-year, 4-year, 5-year projects. The third element is about strengthening intergenerational communication. Many of the times, again, we want to do community development, which is time-bound, small space of time. But then we also need to understand that what we do in community development has implications over generations, because we are impacting on a process that is being handed from one generation to the next. And we need to be able then to be able to intermediate and understand what the youth are saying, what the older persons are saying, and what everybody is saying in terms of what needs to change, so that whatever community development process and the programs we are trying to prosecute, then they can benefit from that communication that is taking place in the community. But most important, also to understand how the communication across generations is packaged. In most of our world, with the changing situations, how the youth manage their communication is not how the older persons manage their communication. And so we need to be able then to communicate in ways that make sense to the different generations in the communities that we are working with. Increasing confidence and capacity of local elders is the fourth element in the change through culture framework. And leadership, again, is about the whole issue of the institutions that have been charged with managing the vision proposition in communities. These leaders could be there. Again, we have talked about the traditional leaders in the elders, but then there are also other leaders from all different shades, including functional leaders, positional leaders, opinion leaders, whom we need then to have them, because they are most of the time they are the vision bearers in the communities. And so as we come and work with them, then we need to be able to understand how do you build their capacity, and most important, confidence in what we are proposing to do with them in their communities. Because again, if we lose the leaders, then we lose everything. And in leadership literature, it's stated that everything rises or falls on leaders. And so if we are prosecuting a process of change, if we don't have the leaders with us in the front, then again, we don't even have the communities with us. Take into account, again, leadership is shared across the community. It's not that some have more leadership capacity than others. And so we need them to be able to understand, to do a very quick mapping of who are the leaders in their communities, and then see how we can build their confidence in themselves, confidence in us as practitioners, and then build their capacities going forward. And then the whole issue of catalyzing dialogue for consensus building between all the actors. Change is disruptive. Community development is disruptive. And so tensions arise, and different, again, interests emerge. And so we need to, again, to be able to build consensus so that we can be able to carry through our process of community development. But most important, we need also to draw from the culture of the community we are working with, mechanisms and wisdom on how to manage tensions, how to manage the process of change in terms of, while also building consensus, so that whatever outcomes then we come up with, then they are informed by what is the best practice, informed by the experience over time, which is of course imbued in the culture of the community. So that ultimately is a community development process and outcome that then has the blessings and the consensus of all actors in the community, both those from within and those from without. But as much as, again, we say we can prosecute change through respect to culture and, of course, working as practitioners, one of the things that I want also to pinpoint is the fact that individuals are the most important element when you are prosecuting a process of change, because ultimately in communities, institutions, in whichever place, we can talk about change, but it is the individuals who have to embrace the change. It is the individual actors who have then to buy into the process of change. And so even when you go out doing social mobilization, ultimately it's the individuals we are looking upon to embrace the change that we are talking about. And that means then we need to build what has been termed as action competence of the actors, so that then they can be able to be enabled to embrace the change and operationalize the change that we are calling upon in the name of community development. And that this is where things become problematic, because you talk about a process of change. When you go and do mapping, then we start coming up with statistics. This percentage has embraced change. This percentage has not embraced the change. This percentage is supportive of the project. This percentage is not supportive of the change. And then we start again asking ourselves what worked, what did not work, what went wrong. But then what is important is this concept I'm calling action competence, borrowed from the works of Brun Jensen, a writer in health education. And one of the things that he brings on board is that if we are going to have action competence, and therefore individuals are going to act in a competent manner, then we need to give, as a community development practitioners, relevant knowledge. And that relevance has to be imbued from the technical perspective and also the cultural perspective, because most of the time we compare the knowledge that we receive from the experts with the knowledge that we have gained for over time, much of which is prescribed by culture. And so that is important. As we give out all the knowledge, then we need to give all the technical knowledge and see how it links up with the existing knowledge that is, can talk about indigenous knowledge or indigenous technical knowledge. And then also, we also need to look at the willingness of individuals to change. And this willingness, again, is going to be based on the calculations that people are going to make. You might want to look at the social exchange theory and the whole issue of how we gain social action, where people are looking at the gains and the losses, the gains and the cost. And out of that, then individuals are going to embrace change, and there they are going to enhance their action competence if they can see they can win, if they can see they can bring about a process of change. But again, culture also comes in terms of how we value the value propositions that are brought to us in the process of change. Then the capacity expectations, what is it that is in place, and outcome expectancy, what is going to change, and when it changes, then how do we position ourselves so that then we can be able to work with that, with the outcomes that are in place, and also the capacity then that we build so that then we can be able to roll out in terms of embracing the change and operationalizing it. At that point, then we can talk about a sustainable community development process if we build the action competence of the actors. And so in as much as we focus communities, let's also take into account that in our community development practice, we also need to focus on the individual actors, whose actors have, again, through the process of socialization, been, again, inculcated in the culture of the community that they belong to. And so, to a large extent, all the forces then that work in the process of to get the individual to embrace the process of change, of course, they are also dependent on systems that go beyond the individual. And Judy Obel and Rach Tariq have come up with an onion model where they just demonstrate where the individual is in the whole process of prosecuting a process of change. And you find the individual is in the center, but as the individual is in the center, which actually should be our focus, then it means we have also to peel through all these systems so that we can reach the individuals, so that we can prosecute the process of change. And as you do that, of course, you understand the individual is subject to the family, which family is the immediate primary agent that works on the individual, the primary socializer, the primary identity builder, the primary role modeling in terms of what needs to happen. And then there's also the community system that is in place, also giving values and propositions and all that, and enforcing the culture of the society, of the community. And then the broad cultural system. Of course, in this, of course, we have institutions that come into place, institutions like the agencies that we work with, institutions like government agencies that, again, have also to carry out the mandate that they have received from the people. And so, meaning then, in as much as we want to prosecute a process of community development, we also need to embrace also these subsystems, which also come up with also subcultural systems, which we need also to appreciate is we usher in the process of change. And so what then we need to do is that individuals have a voice and agency. And that's part of what, again, the sovereignty of the individual needs to come to, in terms of being able to be articulate as part of the Human Rights Declaration of Human Rights, which protect us and our individuality, but then agency, the capacity to act on ourselves. But then again, we are saying as much as that is there, the cultural dictates then intermediate all this in terms of what eventually we do. Given that, again, I'm talking about culture is having a very compassive force on individuals and collectively on all the members of the communities that we work with. Again, as I've indicated, is also from the socio-cultural system that government policies and legal frameworks are derived. If we look at our constitutions and the laws that our parliaments enact, to a large extent, they draw from the prevailing socio-cultural systems that are in place. And so if we are going to do, again, a community involvement process that is legal, to a large extent, you're also saying it is also culturally appropriate. And so by way of conclusion, then, what we are saying is that any community development process has to appreciate, has to recognize and navigate through the cultural imperatives of the community within which it's being undertaken, and the needs, the rights, obligations, and the solutions that we are trying to provide need to be given context and meaning only when they are grounded in the culture that of the community that we're working with. And so as a community development practitioners, then we need to find some center and some place in our community development practice to recenter culture at all times. And so I want to finish by, again, going to Senegal and quoting from Leopold Sédar Senghor, a poet and the first president of the Republic of Senegal, where he observes that culture is the be-all and the end of all development. Culture is everything when you talk about development. And at the end of it all, whatever we do, we should, again, end up with culture. So thank you very much. I have some questions for reflection, which then, again, will guide our discussion going forward in the next few minutes. And one of the issues that, again, we need to look at is that how have we centered culture in our community development practice? What has been our experience? And possibly, what more can we do to center culture in our community development practice? Take into account that the communities we work with are unique and they have unique cultures. What I've talked about here are generics, but then we can customize them in the cultures and of the communities that we work with. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. That was fantastic. Really informative and quite a, I don't know, like a call to service to us all, because I think listening to you speaking, I was thinking about how really we need to slow down in any development process. We need to slow down and take culture into consideration, because if I think of so many projects, as you said, where there are deadlines and there's pressure to perform and there's pressure to spend a budget and so on, culture tends to then get the raw end of the deal, because like you were saying, we don't have time to sit with the elders and listen to them talking about their history and the things that are important to them, and we tend to rush through. And so I think for me, one thing that I took from this is that in the development process, we need to slow down, and we need to be broad. We need to go into a community like with arms open wide and be willing to be fully inclusive. Get the elderly involved, talk with the young people, and get everyone to talk intergenerationally to each other and really understand what are the main cultural aspects and so on, so that we do end up at the end of any community development process with something which is really inclusive and comprehensive and fully taking culture into consideration. So that was a big thing that stayed with me while you were talking. So thank you, Daniel. That was very, very inspiring. Does anyone have any comments or questions? Thank you, Ritu, for being here with us. And we're sorry that we are losing you, but that's fine. It was great to have you with us. Go well.
I'm happy to kick off, Janine.
Sure. Thanks, Jaya.
Just in Australia, we're such a multicultural nation. You know, we've got hundreds of languages, plenty of religions, lots of faith groups. You can then imagine how difficult community development would be. And I just think we probably don't pay enough attention to that in such a multicultural society. And I think this presentation is really a timely reminder that we need to be thinking of the different groups that we're working with in this country, where we can't just apply whatever a normal model is, that we need to be thinking of the different cultural context of the communities that we work with.
Absolutely. And I see an interesting comment from Jim saying neoliberal policies and practices have seemingly undermined cultural traditions, reworking for common good. Community wealth building models are challenging this. And his question is, should community development give more attention to community economic development thinking? You want to add something to that, Jim?
Well, some interesting examples around coming at it globally, then the traditions of a place called Mondragon in Spain is an interesting example of you know, a culture there where everyone contributes to the economy. And as people are young, they have particular roles in the industries. As people get older, then the same industries adjust the physical requirements, you know, and the mental requirements, so that community wealth building has an interesting focus. We have that in what's kind of called the Preston model here, which picks up some of these ideas and is really challenging the kind of neoliberal policies in the UK. And Daniel's input has really encouraged me, and I gather that the Preston model is working with an area of Tanzania, you know, to try and sort of see whether some of the kind of ideas of community wealth building are important. But essentially, we've touched this before in other seminars, that community development has avoided any engagement with the economic development. So, you know, the community economic development has tended to be the weaker kind of initiative. And we heard this in one seminar last year where universities were buying up the land, and whether it was to serve the local community was questionable, or whether it was, you know, for the benefit of the higher education institution, but not necessarily local people. But anyway, I think that is the theme which I'm interested to think about. It's called community wealth building. And I just wonder whether Daniel might have a comment on that.
Daniel, would you like to comment?
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Janine, thank you. Thank you, Jim. And often whenever this story of neoliberalism comes on board, it becomes quite problematic, because then to a large extent, the neoliberalists don't work for anybody. They work for corporations, they work for interests, some of which are hidden in legalese, because then it is this private limited liability company that is acting in the interest of another company, and on and on. In the process, the face of the community disappears. The interest of the community disappears. And this is a point at which then, as community practitioners, we need to be able then to organize the communities that we work with, so that they can also understand that however big some of the interests come on board, ultimately the issue of voice and agency of individuals in communities and communities themselves should never be wished away, because ultimately it is the common good that should count, irrespective of who is benefiting and who is not benefiting. And that means, again, the whole process of advocacy, so that again we can challenge those who can make a difference. And that's why we have governments. And that's why governments again need to have an ear to what the people are interested in, rather than who is paying how much money in the coffers of the governments, because it is common good that should count, rather than the interests of the few. And that's a point that again DeWitt was bringing aboard a few in his recent masterclass, when you talk about community development being about harnessing the voice of the critical masses, so that then we can work for the interests of common good. And when then we are swayed by the neoliberalists, then ultimately what then we start pursuing is not community development, it's another, again, community development enterprise. And we might end up doing community development engineering, as my friend DeWitt was saying in another presentation here. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Any other questions, comments?
Abdul?
Does anyone? Yes, Abdul. Over to
Okay,
you.
thank you very much for this presentation. Just the issue of neoliberal policies and the competition between neoliberal policy and our indigenous culture. You know, Nigeria is a very diverse culture, but then we have certain things that are very common among us. That is, it is an agrarian society based on subsistence farming. Now, we had these little challenges after we did a community work. We did a need assessment for a certain community. We realized that the women in that community are into informal sector of the economy, yes. But then one interesting thing is that when the government was trying to give them palliative, they were demanding for ships. They are demanding for ships, that they are very good in rearing ships. And as such, their palliative should come in form of ships. So we had a problem with the government, the local government, then the county government then, because they were insisting on giving them cash. And then we told them that these people are not interested in cash, they are interested in, so you can see the neoliberal policy insisting on a different thing, while the culture of the people is insisting on a different thing. Then we asked them, what is the value of the ship to the women? They said the ship serves many purposes. During festive periods, these ships are readily available to be sold in the market. That's during Christmas, during Eid al-Kabir and the rest of them, all these festivals. So when they sold it at that period in the market, they make a lot of money, and as such, the demand is very, very high. So, and it is more better for them than you give them just cash that they cannot just spend it. So, but you can see the competition between the bankers prefer to give them money, while these people prefer to be given the ships. And then these ships, they produce at least 4 to 5 within the period of 6 months. I think 3 to 4 within the period of 6 months. So preparing, so when you give them the early part of the year, by the middle part of the year, before the end of the day, they have one ship could now get up to around 6 or 7 at the end of the day. So making more money and then more investment. So what I'm trying to say is that you can see the indigenous culture that is used for production of food and grains, and then they are real in the farms around the house. And so their waste becomes manure again for the farmers. So you can see a multiplier effect of the indigenous culture indigenous knowledge and the rest of them. But then these people would prefer to sell the fertilizer, the organic fertilizer, to the farmers. And as such, this competition is very high. I don't know how Daniel can suggest on how community development can go to the extent of finding a way of marrying the two different, since the multinationals and their economic policy will not be compromised. And again, the local culture is also there. And then with this issue of globalization, digitalization, literacy, and the rest of them, so the local community will be cut off if they do not join into this digital literacy world of not integrating into the global economy. So how do we maneuver ourselves around that very dynamic and very complex relationship? Thank you very much.
Abdu, thank you. I think the invitation is to talk politics that's an area it usually tends to veer away from, because politics is one area where there are so many interests that are so hidden, to the extent that, again, politicians do double speak. But the truth of the matter is that communities know what they want, governments know what they want, politicians know what is important. And most of the time, what we need is, again, to go back to what we are talking about: leadership. Leadership in our communities, leadership in our countries. They need to be able to define that which is important to them. And then, irrespective of whatever is happening in the liberal world, that's the point at which, again, we need also to have some spine to be able to say that according to our way of life that we have agreed as a community, including as a community of nations, global community, this is what is morally acceptable and morally good, and that's what we need to work with. Look at the whole debate of climate change, the whole debate of climate justice. A few individuals, and in the name of individuals and companies, are putting the lives of everybody at risk. And that's what neoliberalism is all about: pursuit of the good for a few. Of course, they'll say through taxes and whatever else, everybody else is going to benefit, and we can assuage the damage that has been done. But what is important, we need to have some leadership all across the board that is able to say, this is what is good for our communities. This is.
Okay, while we wait for Daniel to come back again, I don't know what's happened with his internet. Are you there, Daniel?
While we wait, may I come in here, Janine?
Yes, sure, please do, David.
I hope you can hear me well. What gives I like Dr. Abdullah's comments, but what gives me more ease, and which embraces the cultural concept, is that if you look at community development as the prime purpose would be to enhance the quality of life of people of a target community. Now, that quality of life is pretty much cultural infused. What is quality of life in this community could be quality of life, and it is not necessarily the same quality of life in another community. And I think if we have an approach of my job as a community development practitioner is to enhance the quality of life of people, sort of embraces pretty much the cultural concept, and that I would not go against, then cultural change would be slowly progressive with the accommodation of cultural traits in that community. Just as a comment from my side. Thanks.
Thank you. That's interesting, David. John, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. Well, first of all, I'm glad Daniel's back, because then I can thank him for fantastic presentation. Really went in with great depth, and I love that. So I think what really interests me here, as you've seen from my messages in the chat, is this whole issue of cultural change and the power dynamics, you know, which has been brought up already. And I think sometimes we view culture through a very narrow lens. You know, people use it as a defense, if you like. You say, this is our culture, or this is the cultural norm, you know, and actually it may or may not be, in that there might be some people with significant amounts of power saying that this is our culture and therefore we must, you know, whatever it is. So, you know, that number one, that's a big danger, because you know, it's kind of prescribing a so-called norm by a small number of people onto everybody. And people may well adopt that and say, yes, that's true. But actually, sometimes when you go deeper and you talk to people, and they're not happy with the so-called cultural norm, whatever it is, but they don't have much power to really influence it, you know, so they often go along with it. And what we're seeing right now in Kenya is a very homophobic moment. I can't really describe it as anything else. Those in Kenya will know exactly what I'm talking about. And we're getting repeatedly told by people at a very senior level in government, in religious institutions, etc., that homosexuality is against our culture, and it's unchristian. And then, of course, you can say, well, where did Christianity come from? Is it even Kenyan? But I think the point is, now in the last few days, quite a number of people have been speaking up and saying, well, actually, there are gay and lesbian Kenyans, and there always have been, and bisexual and transgender, you know. So, but what I'm hearing is the dominant voice is just, you know, asserting their power, really. And of course, there are other examples, but this is a really difficult moment in this country. I'm sure those who are here will agree with that. And then finally, the other thing I wanted to say was that some of the best projects I've seen have been those that have really worked closely with, obviously with communities, but trying to get deep into that culture and helping people to see where they could change that culture for the better. And I'm thinking of a number of projects in different countries tackling FGM, you know, where actually it got to the point where community leaders and religious leaders started saying, yes, actually, we want to change our culture for the better so that it's not so oppressive towards women and towards young girls in this case. In other words, it is possible. And I think that's what prompted me to put that quote from Chimamanda as well, saying that, you know, culture is not a static thing, basically. Thanks.
Thanks, John. That's all very, very good points and powerful comments there. And I think it goes back to that thing of, it's the pace at which community development takes place and the context, because it's not for us to go in and change culture, change communities, change people, develop them. It has to be a collaboration. We are just there as guests, as visitors to the process. And as Daniel was saying, it's people know what they want, and people have the power ultimately to do what they want to do. They just sometimes maybe need a bit of support, a bit of encouragement, a bit of endorsement and affirmation of themselves as people, if they've been in a situation where they've always been downtrodden and so on. So I think it is, it's just taking the time to be inclusive and to incorporate everybody. Anthony, see your hand is up.
Thank you. Just regarding the culture, and to back up what Jaya was saying earlier with regard to the mix of cultures in Australia, we have a day once a year called Australia Day, where we celebrate the landing of Captain Cook and it is rather cynically referred to as Invasion Day by quite a lot of the people in the country, and there's calls to ban the day, to change the day, to change the name. Through my association with the Rotary Club, we organised a Australia Day breakfast down at the local park. There was probably 400 people turn up. We organised dancers from probably 4 or 5 different countries that were resident within our area. They danced, there was food provided by them, the traditional dress. The audience was invited in to dance with them, including the local Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, the Noongar mob. It was a fully inclusive affair, and it was really, really encouraging to see the local community welcoming that kind of community, development in that way within the community. The frustration with community development in my area is, I think, the government, local government, community development teams are not focused on the micro community, more on the whatever it is the government tells them to do, and they're more involved in other aspects. Myself as a individual community development practitioner, trying to integrate myself into the community as a CD practitioner was nigh on impossible. I even applied for jobs at the council to work with the council, but that wasn't successful either. But so yeah, there's that. As a CD practitioner, it's quite difficult to have a voice.
Yeah.
But I'm finding it easy now that I've joined the Rotary Club, who are a community development organisation, and having that networking ability through them, it's quite heartening.
And I think a large part of it is just getting to understand, like you say, in a very diverse society like in Australia, and the same in South Africa. And we've lived so separately for so long, and now we're trying to come to a place where we're understanding each other and just learning about each other. And that in itself is a huge process, because you tend to look at person from another culture or a society in another culture with your own assumptions and your own stereotypes and so on. And you think, oh, I know those guys. I know exactly who they are, what they're all about. But I've never actually gone and had a conversation or a cup of tea or even visited their homes or been into their area. And I think a huge part of community practitioner work is just getting to know people and just, getting to know a community, and not with any agenda or any, motive behind it, just making friends really, and understanding people better, because that's where you begin to get an understanding of the culture and of people, and then you can move forward from there.
Open heart, open mind.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Unfortunately, though, Janine, that aspect of community development is not considered within the funding models. So that relationship building, which is so vital to community development, is not considered when you're delivering a project.
Yeah, no, true. It's absolutely true. I mean, I work with the asset-based, the ABCD model, and the first part of the whole process is just literally connecting, talking to people, making friends, finding out about people. And as you say, no one, they say, yeah, but what have you done? Where are the deliverables? And you say, well, it's relationship, and it's not seen as something important, but it's critical. Akinbo, your hand is up.
Thank you, Johnny. Okay, so just a few minutes, because I need to step into another meeting. And I believe the beauty of this particular webinar, apart from being, it's okay, so the beauty is having to, go deep into those communities and regions and trying to let them understand what all this is about, community development. I have run a few organizations, and the first thing we look at is not the priority or the basic objects of how to get funding, but how to first of all create a basic relationship. The basic relationship is allowed to mature to a sense that whatever you bring to them on trust, they would be able to. I'm talking Africa, I'm talking Nigeria. So most times the countries we have also had to engage with, we tell them, do something that is not on the purview of getting a fund or a sponsor or support, but do something that they see on ground and are able to relay themselves with. Give them the opportunity to win. Once you give them the average person the opportunity to win in communities where women are not even allowed to come out, then you begin to not change the culture, but improve the culture in the direction of developmental growth. So at the end of the day, the best place where we can all find ourselves is having more discussions, sharing best practices before moving on to who can give us support. At the end of the day, we get somewhere that we can be able to build a strong foundation. A strong foundation. Culture games is all about talking the history, talking the heritage, talking the food, which is the fun aspect of it, because there is no developmental growth without talking fun, without enjoying yourself on the job. If you don't enjoy yourself and you don't make them feel that they own it, then getting the content for the real deal becomes hard. Passing other form of developmental projects will become very impossible. I'm with the Internet Society Nigerian chapter, the vice chair for the chapter advisory council. All over the world, I've noticed that culture plays a role in development. Everyone agrees on that. But the approach based on different regions now matters. I think that is where we need to lay more emphasis on. I love the deep presentation. I love the community. And thank you for giving me the floor.
Thank you, and go well into your next meeting. Thank you for those rich comments. Daniel, would you like to, if there are no more questions, I'm just aware of keeping people on a busy morning, afternoon. Any wrapping up thoughts, Daniel?
Okay, thank you, Janine. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, you can.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, my net dropped a bit. I'm glad to be back. Yeah, we had a similar incident last time and it became quite messy, but I'm glad that this time is working. So I want to thank everybody for the kind words and comments and the participation that we've received. Culture is quite emotive because, again, culture can be very personal. And even as we talk about multicultural communities, again, even as much as we want to open up, we have been conditioned and trained in a certain way and wired in a certain way by our communities. And of course, culture changes, but unfortunately, in some cases, it doesn't change in our lifetime. And most of the time, we want to see change in our lifetime, but it doesn't happen in our lifetime. And so this is one of the things that we need to cultivate. We are going to bring a process of change. We are just going to make us more cheap in the whole process, but things will change all the same. And so one of the things I'll call upon is patience, even as we work with communities. And many of the times, again, we also need to accommodate many of the actors that we have to work with when they become so passionate and quote unquote say, this is our culture, this is our custom, this is our tradition. It doesn't change. And this is how it has always been. And when a few years back, when we were training when training in gender and development was the main thing in the 1990s, one of the things we kept on saying is that some of the things in culture, traditions, customs, values, they have served their purpose. And when they have served their purpose, when it is time to change, we need to change and we need to be bold to change them. And so the analogy that we would come up with is the whole issue of the umbrella. You use the umbrella when it is raining. When it is not raining, you keep it aside and you move on. And so the covering of some of the traditions, some of the customs, some of the value propositions, when they have served their time, it is just like the umbrella. They need to be brought down when they are no longer needed. And in a day like today, when you are talking about, again, gender empowerment and women's, getting women on board to celebrate the gains so far in terms of ensuring gender equity, there are a lot of things that we need to bring to put down, like the umbrella. so that then we can be able to see also what else is happening in the horizon for the good of everybody else. And so thank you very much. And these are discussions that we keep on carrying forward as we become globalized. Again, the challenge to some of the cultural positions that we subscribe to will also be challenged. And so we need to be able to find a way, even as we do our community development practice, then to see how we manage all those intermediating conflicts and tensions that will come up, so that ultimately we can again do a community development practice that is culturally sensitive in time and space. Then next steps, and again, IACD is celebrating 70 years of its existence. We have just prepared, the IACD leadership in this region have prepared a blog that is going to be released in the next few days, just indicating where we are with community development practice in the region. Again, if you have any contributions, again, we are going to be sitting in the website with our blog for quite a bit of time. If you can make some contributions, then please go ahead. But then we have left open the session for April to just celebrate IACD at 70. It will be an open session. Let's come and have a discussion, structured discussion, where we'll structure it ourselves and prosecute it all through in appreciation of where we have come with community development practice in our spaces, in our countries, in the region, and also within the covering of IACD. One of the questions that we had asked within IACD was, what is it that has kept IACD going for 70 years? What is it that's so important that has kept IACD going for 70 years? And if we can be able to discover that in our discussion in April, that would be good enough. And the same, we can also ask ourselves, what is it that has sustained us this far as community development practitioners? Many of the times in the search of the envelope, in the search of the shilling and the cents and whatever currency that applies in your country, people change careers midstream and look for those careers where there is big buck. What is it that has sustained us in community development practice this long, and that is still firing us? And that's what we can come and share and encourage each other and see how we can document the process going forward. So it will be an open session. Again, in the normal way, we will send out the Eventbrite invite, and then we register. Then we have the IACD Practice Insights magazine that again is built around culture and community development. We have received 15 abstracts, many of them centering on culture and development. We have had one also on a topic that is important in community development, but the theme of the magazine for this edition is culture and community development. We were closing at the end of February, but then in light of the fact that we thought we could get a few more submissions in place, we extended the deadline to 15th of March. So kindly, we'll be glad to receive more submissions. I want to challenge our people in the region that I have more submissions from outside the region than from within the region. Now, this region is the cradle of mankind. When you talk about culture, this is where it all starts. And so if we don't have more of representation in that edition from this region, then we are already again doing a disservice to ourselves. So let me encourage all of us to make a submission so that we can have a rich edition that also taps from the region where we are editing this edition from. I'm editing again this edition with my colleague Judy Aubel, and so again, to be glad, some of the friends we have already in this presentation, in this session, they have already put in their abstracts. I'm inviting more abstracts from all of us without due. So that is global. We have, okay. And then again, lastly, I think the World Community Development Conference is coming in June, from 19th of June in Darwin, Australia. I'm sure Anthony Miller is waiting to welcome us in Darwin. So let's continue registering. Submission of abstracts is closed, but registration is open. Let's go and see what is happening down under and celebrate our discipline together for the first time since 2019, when we are going to have again an in-person conference in Darwin, Australia. And so lastly, can we continue celebrating our women and ensuring that we have gender equity and a just society for all of us? Thank you very much, and thank you for the support. Thank you, Janine, for taking us through this session.
Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful time. Have a wonderful week.
Okay, bye-bye.